Hello, everyone. This is one of your co-hosts, Dawood and This week is going to be a little bit different, as I'm sure you can already tell based on the episode title. It's going to be the first half of our discussion of Moh Lhean. Our second half will be coming up next week. Due to a series of unfortunate events that probably could have been easily prevented by yours truly, we had to cut our recording time a little bit short. But I promise that this is, since we had to cut it short, we decided to release it in two halves rather than just put out one really short rushed episode. So that's why the format is a little bit different this week. I apologize for any inconsistency and any inconvenience this may have caused anybody's listening schedules, because I know everybody is formatting their weekly schedules around whether or not Untethered Layers is going to be released on time. I do pray for your forgiveness. But without further ado, here is our first half of our discussion of Moh Lhean, and we will be back next week with our second half. Thank you. Welcome to Untethered Layers. My name is Dawood and
And I'm Rachel Tyler.
And this week we're here to talk about a fun little album that came out last March. Or I guess... Okay, whenever you say like last Saturday, do you mean like... say it's...
I mean the most recent.
Okay.
So would not be last March.
Not last March. March of 2017, this album came out.
Yes.
Moh Lhean. Last week I was... not jet lagged, but just exhausted, and I was so ready to come in with such an enormous amount of energy this week, and then I ate my weight in tacos, and I'm ready to just like. So if you don't hear from me in this episode for like an extended period of time, it's because I've fallen asleep.
Stop.
But Rachel will do all the heavy lifting. We're doing what we normally do, where we'll listen to the album all the way through before we start, just to kind of get our bearings again, even though we've both been listening to it for a while. And then right before we started, Rachel gave me a crash course on Jennifer Hudson, because I had never heard her music before. So now I'm in a Jennifer Hudson mindset, and but we'll get to it.
Switch gears.
We'll switch gears. Yeah. But I want everybody to know, you included, that I'm going to be thinking about Jennifer Hudson this entire time.
Yeah. You should. Everybody listening to this should be thinking about Jennifer Hudson.
Okay. Well, because we were talking about the Cats remake. You said that
she's the only real singer.
Right. Okay. All right.
Or classically trained.
No. Okay. I'm gonna.
Okay. Anyway. Back on topic.
Okay. So March 2017, Moh Lhean was released. Like we talked about last week, this is the one album that we were able to actually anticipate. We were listening around the time of Mumps already and Golden Tickets and stuff like that, but we weren't like super heavily into it until, I'd say, we weren't really into it until what I would say about 3 years ago, something like that.
Wait, what are you talking about?
Into why, like almost like to the extent that we are now.
I think that I guess so, because and I would attribute it to social media, because we didn't really get like Instagram or anything like that until like the end of high school anyway. But I guess
like 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
All that being said, to say that this is the one album that we were, the one why album, like we talked about last week, Testarossa was fresh on our minds for a very long time, but this is the one why album that we were gearing up for very heavily. And whenever we talked about last week how they dropped like half of the album before the album came out. They came out with 3 singles, and I think there's 10 tracks total. And 2 of them are transition tracks, which we talked about also, that this is the only album that we can remember that also has transition tracks, or just like purely
we've talked about, at least.
Or purely instrumental tracks.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we had basically already heard half the album by the time it came out, but that didn't make it any less special for whenever it came out. I was lucky enough to get it a week early because of both my position as assistant music director at the time, and also as a faithful VIP member of Joyful Noise Recordings. Just a quick shout out to them if they want to sponsor this. That would be pointless because we only have a few episodes left anyways. But yeah, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the album and like our reception of it whenever it came out.
Yeah, our personal experiences going through this album coming out, because again, like you said, this was the only one that we anticipated.
Right.
And this album kind of feels like in a different mind space because of that. I discovered, as we've talked about, why or the band Y, around 2000, the end of 2012, I believe. So kind of mid to late high school for me was really full of just listening to all of Y's music. So alopecia, mumps, even golden tickets. I mean, basically everything was all truncated into a very specific time period for me.
And a very short time period as well.
Yeah, really. Well, yeah, give or take a year and a half, 2 years. And so everything, even though each album is distinct in its time period and era for Yoni and the band, all of those albums do kind of sit in one era for me together. Whereas this album, because it came out a few years after that, I was in a different place in my life. It is in a different headspace for me, which is kind of exciting.
Yeah. I think that's why we resonate with this album so deeply. It's because, like, I would agree with you in that, like, I did start listening to Y probably around, I think, like I said, 2010, late 2009 maybe. But even then, I still attribute all those albums because I would listen to all of them at the same time. And then once I started really getting into Y was after Mumps had already come out. So that's kind of bled in with all the albums too. But like you said, Moh Lhean is like, it feels like a new era, not only in Y, but in our listenership of Y as well. Exactly. And I think also just with people in, people who have been listening to Y for since the beginning, I feel like they probably agree, even if they didn't listen to the albums all at once, they can tell just how different this album is, that it is going to be a different era. And so maybe they attribute it. I don't want to speak for any other Y fans other than myself and you, but this album is distinct and different enough to sort of separate itself from the rest of them.
Yeah, it does clearly seem to be coming from a different place than the others. And this one, not counting the Golden Tickets EP or any side projects like Yoni and Getty or anything like that, it was a good 5 years after the last full studio LP, Mumps, which is a fairly long time for a contemporary band, to wait to put out an album.
Silence. Since it did come out so recently, you and I were talking a little bit earlier, it hasn't really had, at least for me, it hasn't had time to cement itself as a classic for Y, at least personally speaking. So whenever I am going throughout my day and I'm like, I want to listen to Y, Moh Lhean is never the one that comes up in my head first. Whenever I listen, when I'm like, I want to listen to Y, I'll pull up Oakland or I'll pull up Alopecia or something like that. But since we were recording this episode, I went back to Moh Lhean and I forgot how fucking good this album is.
Yeah,
like we listened to it,
so
I would
beautiful.
like obsessively whenever it came out. Like I listened to it for like months straight probably. I remember actually at the time that these singles were dropping, I was in RA and we were in the middle of like a mandatory, really important training. And I got the notification on my phone that One Mississippi had dropped on SoundCloud, and I excused myself to go to the bathroom, and I listened to it 3 times straight, like in the bathroom.
Yeah.
I just remember all of the like listening to each one of these songs as they came out so clearly.
I remember that, all the singles. And was it, you said 3 singles, but was it 3 or 4?
I think it was 3. I think it was This Old King, Proactive Evolution, and One Mississippi in that order. But
okay, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, because I know 2 of my favorite tracks, Easy and George Washington, were not singles. They were just part of the entire album release.
Yes.
And I don't think any of the latter tracks were released as singles either. So I think it was just those 3. But yeah, just objectively speaking, it's such a gorgeous sound. It's like it goes back a little bit to the sound of Eskimo Snow and how they talked about it being more open. But this one is that was more open because it seemed a little bit more raw. Like I talked about last week, it sounds almost like a live studio album. But this one is more open and airy because of the production of how gorgeous and how like twinkly everything is.
Twinkly.
Yeah. Twinkly. I think probably stands so deeply in my head because of the lights that they have for the show.
At the show.
Which that was such a good addition for the Moh Lhean tour. I don't know if it would. They probably had it only for the Moh Lhean tour. I don't know if it would go very well with just like a regular, like this Alopecia rerun. I don't think they're gonna have.
Well, they had it for the tour this past.
Yeah, but I think that was like an extended Moh Lhean tour, I think is what it was.
I guess that's true.
Yeah.
Because that's true.
But yeah, like I said, this album is just so, like the sound itself and the production is so gorgeous, both like comparatively to the rest of the discography and just objectively speaking as well. We talked about how Mumps came out to pretty polarizing reviews. Some were not great at all and some were, pretty, they're praising it pretty high. This one was across the board good reviews. Like people loved it. People seemed to be happy with the direction that it had taken away from Mumps, despite the fact that you and I both love Mumps. I'm glad with the sound. I'm glad with the way that this album came out. It's just like gorgeous. Like we're gonna find ourselves digging deep into 2 words this one. I know gorgeous is gonna be one of them.
Oh well, obviously we've talked a lot about the darkness that's really behind most of Y's work and in the past albums that we've talked about. But this album, it's not quite the opposite of Darkness, I think, and it's not necessarily happy, but it feels joyous in a kind of way. Not to get too personal or spiritual, I guess, but I remember this specific sermon that I heard when I was younger, growing up, going to church. And I remember he talked about the difference between happiness and joy, and how joy is so much more complex, and how you can find joy in, I don't want to say difficult situations, because that sounds kind of, dismissive, but basically that happy is a temporary emotion, and joy is supposed to be something you want to live with consistently, no matter what. Obviously, that's a kind of truncated argument, but I was kind of found myself thinking about that while listening to this album, in the sense that it's not a temporary happiness, but it feels like so much more complex than that. It
feels like an almost settling into complacency, with like, you can tell from here on out things are going to be a lot better than they were in the past.
Yeah, I think complacent is kind of a maybe a negative word.
Yeah, no, I guess just I don't want to say
content.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. No, I definitely agree, and I, like you said, not every part of this. You said not every part of this album is necessarily happy, and I agree, but I also don't think a single part of this album is sad or like
I don't think it is
or
either.
Desperate like the old albums.
Or self-pitying.
Exactly. I was trying to think of a way, because this album is just as existential as any of the rest of the albums have been,
if not more so,
but in a more like calm, sort of like content, like kind of going with the flow way. I was trying to think of like a way to succinctly describe this album, or at least a lot of the tracks speak to one particular theme, but some of them don't, and I want to get into that a little bit later. But sort of like this album acting as a love letter to like the unknown, or what Yoni doesn't know.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I came up with it on the drive back from the laundromat today. But yeah, so like the old albums, like I said, are just as existential, but this one is existential as well, but in a whimsical and kind of like glittery kind of way. And I feel like we talked last week about there are some, or a couple weeks ago when we talked about Alopecia, we talked how there were some lines that sum up the entire album. And I think there's a line that sums up at least the journey to this album really, really well. That's not on Moh Lhean. It's on a track that he recorded with Alias back in 2008. And there's this one line. It's the line that will stick out to me more so than any other Yoni line that he's ever written. And it's on Well Water Black. And he says, "I'd like to think I take dictation from something big into." I've talked your ear off about this line, I think, before.
I'd like to think I take dictation from something big and evasive that I've yet to see the face of bracing. But when I'm awake, I'm like a little twig breaking under heavy winds. Weight tore a moth hole in a sweater. I know I could do it better. I know I could do it better. I know I could do it better. I know I could do it better.
Where he talks about that, and it's like he's aware of the fact that he's not totally in control. And in that track, like 10 years ago, like I said, it was recorded. His attitude is a little bit, I think, more in line with his attitude in Alopecia and Mumps era. But I think it sort of works pretty well as a prologue, or as a predecessor to a line that I believe is in One Mississippi, where he says, "I gotta submit to whatever it is in control."
Right.
I know I gotta submit to whatever it is in control. I know, stop throwing shadow on shadow and let it all go.
That line is
right.
very...
Like they portray such similar emotions, and they portray such similar like realizations, but in such different ways. Whereas in this new one, he says, "I gotta submit to whatever it is in control." Like he's okay with like the fact that he's
more
not
accepting.
Exactly, rather than like sort of unknown and kind of like I guess sardonic a little bit, almost like a little sarcastic. But yeah, that was one line that stuck out to me that I think helped set the stage for this album really, really well. That wasn't on this album. I've talked to different people who, not just about Moh Lhean, but in general, who seem to be embarrassed to like whenever I ask what somebody's favorite track off of an album was, if they say that it's one of the singles, they always kind of say it with like a
embarrassment.
It's just a little bit. Yeah, it's just like, oh, I don't want my favorite song to be everybody else's favorite song. But I think genuinely the first the 3 singles that dropped sum up this album so well, and that's why like I think it's bullshit if people are like embarrassed to attribute their favorite song to a single that was dropped, because obviously people release singles for the reasons that they do. They think that they're the strongest on the album, or that they portray what they want the album to come out sounding like. And all that being said, I think like One Mississippi, Proactive Evolution, and This Old King are 3 of the strongest tracks for sure on this album. Sort of the quintessential ones, like we said about Hollows and Good Friday and stuff like that. But there's not a single song on this record that I don't like. There are some that I kind of forget about. The latter tracks, like I said, Consequence of Non-Action, Barely Burn the Water, because they're not as like glitzy and like as poppy and fun as or like as produced as the 3 singles that dropped, or Easy and George Washington. I have a tendency to only listen to the first
the top half
7.
of the
Yeah,
album.
exactly. But going back and listening to those tracks today, like I feel like, at least in a couple of The Water especially, he doesn't really talk about the same, like acceptance of some sort of cosmic
Beyond.
force. Yeah, this beyond, this cosmic force that's in control or whatever. Some of them seem a little bit more narrative, and even in Easy, it's less focused on that and more focused on like a person, or like a Easy is almost like not a love song, but it's like about a person rather than himself. But yeah, so the later tracks on that record, I think, at least personally speaking, sometimes fall to the wayside. But going back and listening to them, they're like really, really strong. And like
I mean, every track on this album is so strong, and you can tell that they really, worked hard on everything. Not only, like we talked about, the amount of time it took for this album to come out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, when the production or the writing began,
Right.
but it's very curated, very well put together. Every track works. I think that, obviously we were upset when we saw it was only 10 tracks, but it works.